She had been working in the mansion for many years, quietly going about her duties, never seeking attention and never asking for anything beyond her modest wage. The house was enormous, filled with expensive furniture, priceless paintings, and sparkling chandeliers that caught the sunlight during the day and reflected the glow of crystal lamps at night. It was a world that seemed far away from her own simple upbringing, a world she had stepped into not by choice, but by necessity. Each morning she would wake before the sun. The house still dark and silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floors as she walked through the empty halls. She would tidy the bedrooms, polish the silverware, and dust the tall shelves that held porcelain figurines and family heirlooms. The staff moved like ghosts through the mansion, each with their own duties. But she had learned early on to stay quiet, invisible, blending into the background like part of the walls themselves. The wealthy man of the house was known for his strict nature and sharp tongue. He had built his fortune from nothing, or so he liked to claim, and he valued success above all else. To him, appearances mattered more than feelings, and he expected perfection from everyone around him. He rarely praised anyone, and when he did, it was often laced with a subtle reminder that nothing was ever truly good enough. His guests often whispered that he had no patience for mistakes. Even small errors were met with scorn or ridicule. Despite this, she carried out her duties with care. She understood the rules of the house and followed them without question. She cleaned quietly, served meals without complaint, and observed the hierarchy that the man had established. She knew where she belonged and accepted it. Her world was small, defined by the tasks she performed each day, and she had learned to find satisfaction in doing them well. There was a rhythm to her life here, a pattern that gave her a sense of control in a house that could otherwise feel overwhelming. The house was preparing for a grand evening event. Invitations had gone out weeks in advance, and the staff worked tirelessly to ensure that everything was perfect. The wealthy man would host prominent figures from business, politics, and society, and he wanted the evening to reflect his status and success. The dining room was meticulously arranged, silverware polished until it shone, and the table adorned with flowers carefully chosen to complement the color scheme of the room. Candles were positioned to create a warm, inviting glow, and the music system had been tested to ensure that every note would reach the corners of the grand hall. She moved through the house as usual, carrying trays of appetizers to the kitchen, arranging chairs in the sitting room, and making sure that every room was spotless. The other staff members were bustling with activity, but she remained focused on her own tasks, a silent observer of the flurry around her. Her attention to detail did not go unnoticed by some of the older staff, who often whispered their admiration for her quiet efficiency, but she did not seek praise. She preferred the work to speak for itself as the evening approached. The guests began to arrive, their cars pulling up the long driveway and gliding under the grand entrance. They were dressed in gowns, suits, and sparkling jewelry, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they were welcomed by the staff. She moved through the corridors, discreetly attending to last-minute details, making sure the glasses were clean, the flowers arranged, and the rooms free of dust. She could hear snippets of conversation from the guests, discussions of business deals, social events, and travel plans. It was a world she did not belong to. Yet she watched with quiet curiosity. The wealthy man moved through the house with an air of authority, greeting guests, making small talk, occasionally casting a glance toward the staff to ensure everything was proceeding smoothly. He had a sharp eye and a quick temper, and he expected the evening to reflect his reputation flawlessly. He had invested considerable time and resources into planning this gathering, and he wanted it to be perfect, down to the smallest detail. She felt the tension in the air, the subtle undercurrent of expectations that seemed to weigh on everyone in the house. She continued with her work, careful not to draw attention to herself. But she could not help noticing the way the wealthy man moved with confidence, commanding the room, and the way the guests responded to his presence. It was a world that operated on power, wealth, and influence, and she felt both intimidated and fascinated by it in the midst of the activity. She found herself drawn to the piano in the corner of the sitting room. It was a grand instrument, polished to perfection, with ivory keys that gleamed under the soft light. She had played piano as a child, though it had been many years since she had touched the keys. The music had always been a source of comfort, a private escape from the challenges of life, and the sight of the instruments stirred memories she had kept carefully tucked away. She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keys, remembering the lessons, the practice, and the joy that music had once brought her. In this moment, she felt a quiet connection to something larger than herself, a reminder that she possessed talents and passions that no one in the house had ever acknowledged. It was a small, private thought, one that she did not share with anyone, and it gave her a sense of strength and calm amidst the flurry of activity. The guests were beginning to settle into the sitting room, their conversations growing louder, their laughter echoing through the hallways. She continued her work, but her mind lingered on the piano. She imagined playing softly, letting the music fill the room, and wondered if anyone would even notice. The thought was fleeting, almost dangerous, for she knew her place was in the shadows, not in the spotlight. The wealthy man, moving from guest to guest, finally noticed her standing near the piano. He raised an eyebrow, a small, sharp smile playing on his lips, and for a moment, she felt the familiar tension of scrutiny. He was unpredictable, and she knew that his attention could be both a burden and a test. She straightened, preparing herself to respond if called upon. Though she hoped to remain unnoticed, as the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew more lively. The guests enjoying the food, the wine, and each other's company. The house seemed to pulse with energy, every room filled with conversation and movement. She moved through the spaces with care, attending to needs as they arose, her presence almost invisible. A silent guardian of order amidst the chaos, she noticed the wealthy man glance toward the piano again, this time with a more deliberate look. He seemed amused, perhaps curious, or perhaps plotting something. She quickly returned to her tasks, pretending not to notice, but a small part of her heart quickened. The piano had always been a part of her life, a part that no one in this house had ever acknowledged, and now it seemed as if it might become a focal point. The guests continued to mingle, and the man finally called for attention, drawing everyone's eyes toward him. He spoke with his usual charm, welcoming the guests, sharing anecdotes of his success, and making light jokes. She listened from the sidelines, careful to remain unobtrusive, but she could feel the anticipation in the air, the subtle tension that suggested something unexpected was about to happen. Her fingers brushed the piano keys unconsciously, the cool ivory sending a shiver up her spine. She felt the music calling to her, a whisper from the past that demanded acknowledgement. She glanced around, seeing the guests' faces animated with laughter and conversation, and felt a mix of fear and longing. The piano was a temptation she had not anticipated, a chance to step out of the shadows, even if only for a brief moment. The wealthy man's eyes met hers. She understood that the moment had arrived. Whether she was ready or not, she was about to be drawn into the spotlight, her hidden talent standing at the edge of revelation. The house, filled with wealth, power, and expectation, was about to witness something that no one had anticipated. And for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of excitement, fear, and hope, all mingling in a single, quiet moment near the piano in the grand mansion. The evening was in full swing, with laughter and conversation filling every corner of the mansion. The air smelled faintly of perfume, fresh flowers, and the rich scent of polished wood. Guests moved gracefully between rooms, chatting and sipping drinks, while the staff worked quietly in the background, ensuring that every need was met. She continued her duties, carrying trays, adjusting seating, and discreetly tidying as she went, but her mind kept drifting back to the piano. The wealthy man, standing near the center of the room, noticed her lingering by the grand instrument. A mischievous, almost cruel smile crossed his face. He had always enjoyed showing off his authority, testing those around him. He suddenly had an idea that promised to entertain the guests while asserting his power. He called her over with a sharp gesture. Her heart sank, but she obeyed, moving toward him with slow, careful steps. "Why don't you play something for us?" he said, his voice smooth but edged with a mocking tone. The guests, hearing this, looked toward her with curiosity. Some smiled politely, thinking it would be a brief, harmless entertainment. Others exchanged knowing glances, expecting her to falter, expecting the moment to be amusing rather than impressive. She froze for a second, the words ringing in her ears. Play here? In front of all these people? Her palms felt clammy, and her throat tightened. She had played the piano countless times in private, but never in front of an audience like this, never under scrutiny, never as the target of someone else's amusement. Yet she knew she could not refuse. In this house, defiance could have consequences, and she had learned long ago to navigate such challenges carefully. She walked slowly toward the piano, each step echoing slightly on the polished floors. The guests watched her, some whispering quietly, others waiting with polite interest. The wealthy man leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, his expression one of expectation mixed with amusement. The staff around her shifted nervously, glancing at one another. Uncertain of what would happen next, when she reached the piano, she paused, taking a deep breath. Her fingers hovered above the keys, remembering the feel of them under her touch. The familiar resistance of the ivory and wood. The room seemed to hold its breath along with her. The first notes were hesitant, soft, almost a whisper. The guests leaned forward slightly, curious, some smiling politely, some clearly entertained by the possibility of watching her struggle. Then, as if a switch had been flipped inside her, her hands began to move with more confidence. The music grew, filling the room, not loud, but precise and expressive. It was clear from the first few measures that she was no amateur. The notes flowed smoothly, each chord carefully placed, each phrase deliberate. A hush fell over the guests. The initial amusement faded into surprise and then into admiration. Eyes widened, conversation stopped, and the only sound was the piano, carrying the weight of skill and emotion. The wealthy man's smile faltered. He had expected awkwardness, nervous mistakes, maybe a stutter in the melody, but there was none of that. The music was beautiful, skillful, and moving. He felt a strange sense of discomfort, a realization that his attempt to humiliate her had backfired. His guests, on the other hand, were captivated. Some leaned closer to listen, some whispered to their neighbors, all trying to understand who this quiet maid was and how she could play like this. Her confidence grew with each note. She remembered the countless hours she had spent practicing as a child, the lessons she had taken secretly, the music that had been her sanctuary. It all came back in this moment, and for the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a maid, not as someone invisible, but as a person with talent and depth. The piano became an extension of her, her emotions translating directly into sound, each note telling a story that words could not convey. The guests were silent now, enraptured by the music. The wealthy man stood rigid, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and unease crossing his face. He had underestimated her, assuming her quiet demeanor meant lack of skill, lack of substance. The sound of the piano shattered that assumption. The room, once filled with casual conversation, was now united in the shared experience of her music. Some guests whispered to one another, asking questions about her background, wondering how a maid could play with such sophistication. The contrast between her position in the house and the depth of her talent created a tension that was palpable. The wealthy man realized that his attempt to entertain had turned into a moment of revelation, and it was no longer about him. The spotlight had shifted, and she had stepped into it gracefully. The music continued, weaving through melodies that were both familiar and unexpected, blending technical skill with genuine feeling. It was not a performance meant to impress superficially. It was authentic, coming from the heart. Guests felt the emotion behind the notes. Some moved to tears, others simply unable to look away. The room seemed transformed, the air charged with a mixture of awe and respect. The wealthy man's mind raced. He had thought he could assert his dominance, make her appear foolish, and entertain his guests at her expense. Instead, she had revealed a hidden world, a talent he had never anticipated, a depth that made him suddenly aware of his own assumptions and arrogance. The music held a quiet power, exposing the vulnerability in his attempt to belittle her and highlighting her strength and resilience. She finished the piece with a gentle, a lingering chord that seemed to hang in the air, refusing to be rushed or ignored. There was a pause, a moment of silence that felt longer than it was, as the guests absorbed what they had just experienced. Then, applause erupted, genuine and heartfelt, filling the room with warmth and admiration. Some guests stood, some clapped softly, all acknowledging the skill and emotion she had displayed. The wealthy man clapped as well, though it felt forced, awkward. He approached her slowly, uncertain of what to say. For the first time, he saw her not as a servant, not as someone to be mocked or controlled, but as a person with abilities and passions he had overlooked. The realization was uncomfortable, a challenge to his ego, but unavoidable. The music had spoken the truth more clearly than any words could. She rose from the piano, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. She met the eyes of the guests, feeling their admiration and respect, and a quiet sense of pride filled her. She had faced a moment of potential humiliation and transformed it into a declaration of her worth. Her life in the mansion would never be the same after this night. Not because the house had changed, but because she had changed. And others had seen it. The wealthy man looked around at the guests. Noting their reaction, the subtle shift in their perception, he understood, perhaps reluctantly, that his attempt to shame her had failed. And in its place, something remarkable had emerged. The power dynamic in the room had shifted quietly, imperceptibly, yet undeniably. The maid was no longer invisible. She had claimed her space through talent, courage, and the simple, undeniable force of music. The rest of the evening continued, but the energy had changed. Conversations now included questions about her, expressions of admiration, and gentle praise. The wealthy man remained thoughtful, subdued, reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. She moved through the room with quiet confidence, attending to her duties, but aware of the new respect she had earned. The piano, once a silent witness to her life, had become the instrument of revelation, transforming perception and asserting her presence in a world that had long overlooked her. As the applause from the previous piece died down, she took a deep breath and allowed her hands to linger on the keys. The room had transformed in a matter of minutes, the hum of conversation replaced by a quiet attention that seemed to wrap around her like a warm cloak. Guests who had been skeptical moments ago now looked at her with curiosity and wonder. Their eyes reflected a mix of admiration and surprise, as if they were witnessing something rare and precious. She began another piece. Slower this time, deliberate and full of emotion. Each note carried a story, a memory, a fragment of her life that had long been hidden behind the walls of the mansion. She thought of her childhood, the early mornings spent practicing in a small, quiet room, the sacrifices made by her family to give her a chance at learning music. The piano had been her refuge, a place where she could pour her heart and forget the struggles of the outside world. Now, she'll let that part of herself flow freely, unguarded and authentic. The guests were drawn in, their expressions softening as they listened. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others leaned closer, captivated by the skill and emotion in every note. The wealthy man, standing near the back of the room, felt a strange sensation, a mix of awe and discomfort. He had never imagined that the quiet maid he had overlooked could possess such depth and talent. His earlier attempt at mockery now seemed foolish and petty. With each passing measure, the room grew more silent, the only sound being the piano itself. She did not play for attention or approval. She played for herself, for the years of practice and passion that had remained unseen. The music revealed not just technical skill, but a profound understanding of feeling and expression. It was clear to anyone listening that she had dedicated her life to the piano, that it was an inseparable part of who she was. As she continued, she remembered the obstacles she had faced. Life had not been easy, and opportunities had been scarce. Her family had struggled financially, and she had taken on work wherever she could to support them. Learning the piano had been a luxury, one that required discipline, sacrifice, and determination. Every late night spent practicing, every moment of frustration and doubt had shaped her. And now those experiences were reflected in her playing. The wealthy man watched as the guests responded to her music. Some whispered softly to each other, expressing admiration for her skill. Others simply sat in quiet contemplation, moved by the raw emotion conveyed through her performance. He felt a sense of unease, a recognition that his assumptions about people had been superficial and shallow. Talent, he realized, did not reside in wealth or status. It could flourish anywhere, even in those he had considered insignificant. She shifted seamlessly into a more complex piece, her fingers dancing across the keys with precision and grace. The music carried a sense of urgency, a subtle tension that reflected her own inner struggles. She had learned to channel her emotions into her playing, to transform fear, doubt, and longing into something beautiful. Each chord told a story, and though no words were spoken, the room seemed to understand the depth of her journey. Guests were now fully immersed, some leaning forward with wide eyes, others sitting back, lost in the melody. The wealthy man found himself reflecting on his own life, the choices he had made, the moments he had taken for granted. The contrast between his world of wealth and privilege and her world of quiet, struggle, and hidden talent became strikingly apparent. He had believed himself superior, but the music reminded him that there were strengths and achievements that money could never buy. As she reached the climax of the piece, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Her hands moved with a combination of skill and emotion that could not be ignored. The piano resonated with power, the notes filling every corner of the grand room. The guests felt a profound connection, as if they were hearing not just music, but the story of her life, her dedication, and her resilience. Some were visibly moved, tears glistening in their eyes, while others simply sat in awe, unable to speak. The wealthy man felt a stirring of humility, a realization that he had underestimated her. His attempt to dominate and belittle had been rendered meaningless by her talent and courage. He had sought to control the moment, to showcase his power, but instead, he had witnessed something far greater, the quiet strength of a person who had nurtured her abilities in secrecy and emerged with a skill that demanded respect. She slowed the pace, transitioning into a gentle, contemplative section. The notes became softer, more reflective, carrying a sense of longing and introspection. She thought of the people who had believed in her when no one else did, the mentors and friends who had encouraged her, the quiet moments of practice that had shaped her. The music became a conversation, a dialogue between her past and present, between her experiences and the audience, who now listened so intently. The guests were captivated by the narrative conveyed through the music. They sensed the depth of her story, the layers of emotion and experience that had been hidden behind her quiet demeanor. The wealthy man, for the first time, saw her not as a servant, not as someone to be dismissed, but as a person with remarkable talent, resilience, and grace. His initial amusement and arrogance had been replaced by respect. Tinged with a hint of regret for underestimating her, she continued to play, her hands moving with confidence and control, yet carrying a delicate sensitivity that made each note meaningful. The music filled the space between people, bridging gaps, breaking down preconceptions, and creating a shared experience that transcended social boundaries. Guests who had arrived with preconceived notions found themselves reevaluating their judgments, realizing that true ability and character often existed in unexpected places. As the piece drew to a close, she allowed the final notes to linger, letting them resonate and fade naturally. The room remained silent for a moment, as if in reverence, before the applause began. It was louder this time, more heartfelt, filled with genuine admiration and appreciation. Some guests stood, clapping enthusiastically, while others wiped away tears. Moved by the depth and beauty of the performance, the wealthy man approached her, his expression complex, a mixture of awe, surprise, and introspection. He extended a hand, not in command or control, but in acknowledgement. It was a subtle gesture, yet it carried a profound significance, recognition of her talent, her courage, and her humanity. She nodded politely, a quiet smile on her lips, feeling a sense of validation and pride that was entirely her own. The atmosphere in the mansion had shifted irrevocably. The guests continued to converse, but the energy was different now, infused with respect and a renewed awareness of the person they had just witnessed. The wealthy man, standing near the back of the room, reflected on the evening, understanding that the events that had unfolded were not just about music, but about character, resilience, and the unexpected power of talent nurtured in obscurity. She returned to her duties, moving with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. The piano had been a conduit, a means of expressing herself and revealing her hidden depths. It had transformed the perceptions of those around her, and in doing so, it had transformed her own sense of self. The room, once dominated by wealth and hierarchy, now held a new understanding that true talent and strength could not be measured by status, and that every person carried within them stories and abilities waiting to be recognized. The evening continued, but the impact of her performance lingered. Guests spoke of it in hushed tones, sharing their astonishment and admiration. The wealthy man, though still processing the revelation, could not ignore the truth that had been made clear by her music. It was a moment that would remain in the memories of everyone present, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that every individual, regardless of position, had the potential to inspire and astonish through skill, courage, and authenticity. The room had fallen into a rare silence after her second performance. The guests, still captivated, looked at her with a mixture of wonder and respect that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. She moved away from the piano slowly, feeling the subtle shift in the atmosphere, aware that something profound had taken place. The laughter and chatter that had once dominated the room were replaced by quiet conversations, nods of appreciation, and a new awareness of her presence. The wealthy man, standing near the back, observed her with a complex expression. His ego, once unshakable, had been gently cracked by the power of her talent. He had attempted to assert control, to use her as entertainment for his guests. But she had transformed the moment into one of admiration and revelation. There was a subtle tension in him, a recognition that the balance of power in the room had changed. Even if he did not yet fully admit it, she returned to her duties, quietly moving through the room, adjusting chairs and serving drinks. But there was a noticeable difference in the way she carried herself. Her steps were more confident, her posture taller, her movements imbued with a quiet assurance. The guests who once saw her as merely a maid now regarded her as someone with depth, skill, and dignity. The air of invisibility that had long surrounded her had dissipated, placed by a presence that could not be ignored. Conversations among the guests began to shift. No longer were they focused solely on the wealth and status of the host. Instead, they discussed her performance, expressing admiration for the unexpected talent displayed by someone they had previously overlooked. Whispers spread about her dedication, her skill, and the emotional impact of her playing. The room seemed smaller now, more intimate, as if her music had drawn everyone closer together. Erasing some of the barriers imposed by wealth and social standing, the wealthy man, feeling the subtle change in perception, approached her cautiously. His usual confidence was tempered by the realization that she had achieved something remarkable. He had thought the evening would revolve around him, his ability to entertain, and his display of power. Instead, she had taken the spotlight and redefined it, not through arrogance or manipulation, but through talent, grace, and authenticity. He spoke to her quietly, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. "I did not expect that," he said, a simple acknowledgement that carried weight far beyond its words. She nodded politely, not seeking praise, but accepting the recognition that was due. There was no need for confrontation or argument. The music had spoken for her, and the truth of her abilities could not be denied. The guests, sensing the shift, began to treat her differently. They asked questions, not out of condescension, but from genuine curiosity and admiration. They wanted to know about her background, her training, and how she had developed such remarkable skill. She answered with humility, sharing only what felt appropriate. But the room listened intently, eager to understand the person behind the music, as she continued her work. A subtle camaraderie began to emerge among the staff. They had long respected her abilities in private. But now, the acknowledgement from the guests, and even the wealthy man, brought a new sense of pride and solidarity. She moved through the house with quiet confidence, aware of the impact her performance had made, yet remaining grounded in the tasks that defined her daily life. Her world had expanded, but she had not lost her humility or her sense of purpose. The wealthy man, still processing the evening, reflected on the assumptions he had made about people. He had believed that status and wealth could dictate worth, that he could control perception and dictate admiration. Her music had shattered that illusion, revealing that true value and talent often existed in unexpected places. It was a lesson he had not anticipated, and it left him quietly reevaluating not only his opinions of her, but of others as well. She paused for a moment near the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys. The instrument had become a symbol, not just of her talent, but of her ability to navigate challenges with grace and resilience. It had transformed the room, challenged assumptions, and shifted the dynamics of power in a space that had long been defined by hierarchy and control. The music had given her a voice, one that was acknowledged and respected by all who had heard it. The guests began to mingle again. But the energy was different. There was a sense of equality, a subtle understanding that talent and character transcended status. The wealthy man, observing this change, felt a quiet humility. He had seen the power of authenticity, the impact of genuine skill and dedication, and he could not ignore it. His previous attempts to dominate or entertain at her expense now seemed small and inconsequential compared to the larger truth. Revealed by her music, she continued her duties. Moving through the mansion with a grace that was both natural and earned, the staff treated her with renewed respect. And even the wealthy man found himself considering her perspective in a way he had never done before. The shift was subtle but undeniable. She had claimed a space for herself not through confrontation, but through the quiet demonstration of her abilities. The room, once dominated by hierarchy and expectation, had been transformed by her presence and her music. The evening wore on, and the guests prepared to leave. Conversations reflected the new understanding that had emerged. Stories of admiration for her talent woven into discussions of business, social events, and mutual acquaintances. The wealthy man escorted them to their vehicles, his mind still reflecting on the unexpected turn of the evening. He had sought to assert control and dominance, but instead, he had witnessed something far more powerful, a quiet, unwavering talent that commanded respect and admiration. After the last guest had departed, the mansion returned to its usual quiet. She moved through the rooms, tidying and organizing, but there was a difference in the way she did so. The air around her carried a sense of accomplishment and recognition, a quiet triumph that was both personal and public. The piano, once an instrument she had played in private, had become a bridge between her world and that of the guests, a symbol of talent, resilience, and the ability to transform perception through authenticity. The wealthy man, standing near the piano, approached her once more. His expression was thoughtful, his usual arrogance tempered by the realization of her impact. "You have a gift," he said quietly. "I underestimated you." She nodded, acknowledging his words without seeking further validation. The music had already conveyed everything necessary, and the truth of her abilities was evident to all who had witnessed it. The mansion, now quiet and still, seemed to hold a sense of reverence. The events of the evening had created a lasting impression, not just on the guests, but on everyone present. The balance of power, once rigid and unchallenged, had shifted subtly but irrevocably. She had demonstrated that talent, courage, and authenticity could transcend social boundaries, reshape perception, and command respect without arrogance or confrontation. As she prepared for the final tasks of the evening, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The piano had been a conduit, a means of expressing herself and revealing her hidden depths. The guests had seen her, the wealthy man had acknowledged her, and the staff had gained a renewed sense of pride in her abilities. The night had proven that recognition and respect could be earned not through status or force, but through dedication, skill, and the quiet confidence to share one's gifts when the moment called for it. The evening ended, but its impact lingered. Conversations among the staff, reflections of the wealthy man, and the admiration of the guests all carried the memory of her performance. She moved through the mansion with a sense of calm and pride, aware that she had changed the perception of those around her. The piano, once a silent companion, had become a symbol of transformation, empowerment, and the quiet strength that comes from embracing one's talents and allowing them to shine when the moment demands it. The night had finally drawn to a close, and the mansion, which had been filled with laughter, chatter, and music just hours earlier, now held a quiet calm. The guests had left their goodbyes echoing softly in the vast hallways, and the staff moved slowly through the rooms, tidying and restoring order after the evening's events. She walked among them, her steps light, yet confident, carrying a quiet pride that had not existed at the start of the night. The piano, still polished and gleaming under the dim lights, seemed to reflect the sense of accomplishment that filled the space. The wealthy man stood near the grand staircase, his posture relaxed, but his mind occupied. He had spent the evening orchestrating the gathering, expecting admiration for his wealth and influence. What he had not anticipated was being overshadowed, not by another wealthy or famous person, but by someone he had considered beneath his notice. The quiet maid, whom he had intended to use as amusement, had revealed a depth, talent, and courage that he could not ignore. He felt a mixture of humility, surprise, a strange gratitude for the unexpected lesson he had learned. She moved to the piano, placing her hands lightly on the keys as if to thank it for being her voice, her refuge, and her instrument of revelation. The memory of the evening's music still lingered in her mind. The faces of the guests, the shifting expressions of the wealthy man, and the feeling of finally being seen and acknowledged. It had been more than a performance. It had been a declaration, a quiet assertion of her worth and talent. The piano had spoken for her in a way that words never could. The staff gathered in small groups, whispering about the events, sharing their admiration for her skill, and discussing how the evening had changed the dynamics in the mansion. For years, she had been invisible, a background presence performing duties without recognition. Now, she had earned a quiet respect that was palpable. The air carried a sense of possibility, a realization that talent and character could not be ignored. No matter the social barriers that had previously dictated perception, the wealthy man approached her, his usual commanding presence softened by reflection. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I underestimated you. What you showed tonight was beyond anything I imagined." She met his gaze, acknowledging the words without the need for further explanation. The music had already conveyed the message that she was not someone to be belittled, that her skills and her spirit commanded respect, and that her worth extended far beyond her role in the household. Her response was simple, a nod and a small, gracious smile. She did not seek vengeance or superiority, only recognition and dignity. The wealthy man, absorbing the moment, felt a shift within himself. His pride had been challenged, not destroyed, but refined by the encounter. He realized that true respect was earned through action and authenticity, not demanded through wealth or status. Her performance had taught him this, and he could not ignore the truth. The guests who had attended the evening carried their impressions with them as they returned home, sharing stories of the unexpected talent of the maid, the grace with which she had performed, and the way she had transformed the room without arrogance or pretense. Conversations at other social gatherings would inevitably return to this night, recounting the story of a quiet, unassuming person who had captivated everyone with skill, emotion, and quiet courage. Her name, once unknown and insignificant to most, now resonated as someone remarkable. Back in the mansion, the staff continued to work, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a subtle sense of camaraderie, respect, and acknowledgement that had been absent before. She moved among them, fulfilling her duties, yet aware that her presence was now recognized in a way it had never been. The piano, standing in the corner, remained a silent witness, a reminder of what had been accomplished and of the power of patience, dedication, and authenticity. In the following days, the wealthy man found himself reflecting repeatedly on the events. He considered his assumptions about people, the way he had measured worth by status and appearance, and the lesson that had been delivered by the music. The maid, in her quiet and unassuming way, had revealed a world he had overlooked. showing him that true talent and character could not be judged by outward appearances alone. He began to treat her differently, with respect and a recognition that extended beyond mere politeness. She, for her part, continued her work as before, but with a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. The recognition she had received was not something she had sought aggressively. It had come as a natural consequence of her abilities and her courage to allow them to be seen. She understood that her journey was not complete, that life would continue with challenges and expectations. But she also knew that she now carried a sense of empowerment that no one could take away. The mansion, with its grand halls, polished floors, and glittering chandeliers, remained the same in many ways. But the energy within it had shifted. There was a new understanding, an acknowledgement of talent, effort, and dignity that transcended social roles. The guests who had attended the evening carried this understanding with them. And even those who had not been present would hear the stories and feel the impact of what had occurred. She found moments of quiet reflection at the piano, allowing her fingers to trace the keys gently, recalling the evening's performances and the faces of those who had listened. Music had always been her refuge, her means of expression, and now it had also become her voice in the world. She realized that she had gained something far more enduring than applause, a recognition of her worth, a validation of her talent, and a subtle but undeniable shift in the way she was perceived. The wealthy man, observing from a distance, felt a new respect. He had witnessed the power of authenticity and skill firsthand, and he understood that his previous notions of superiority were incomplete. He began to approach his interactions with others, both staff and guests, with a greater awareness of the value of talent, effort, and personal character. The evening had changed him, quietly but significantly, and he carried the lesson forward in his decisions and behavior in the quiet aftermath. The mansion settled into its normal rhythm, yet the echoes of the piano, the energy of the evening, and the lessons learned remained. She moved through the halls with quiet pride, aware of the respect she had earned and the transformation that had taken place. Her world had expanded not through wealth or status, but through the courage to embrace her gift and allow it to be recognized. The piano, once a private companion, had become a symbol of empowerment, resilience, and the profound impact one person could have by simply being true to themselves. As the night fully settled, she paused by the piano one last time. Her hands rested lightly on the keys, not to play, but to acknowledge the journey she had taken, the moments of fear and courage, and the way her life had changed in the span of a single evening. The mansion, with all its grandeur, had witnessed her story, and in doing so, she had rewritten the perception of herself and the world around her. The evening's music had been more than performance. It had been transformation, respect earned, pride broken, and dignity restored. And in that quiet, gentle moment, she felt a sense of completion, knowing that she had claimed her place not through force, but through the quiet, undeniable power of her talent and heart.